The Tyr thought fear was a law of physics. They erased a human coastline on live broadcast, invited 200 civilizations to study our grief, and told us to kneel in 7 days or be corrected. On day 7, Earth did broadcast an event the galactic feeds would tag as Orpheus. Not missiles. Not suns going dark. A funeral. By minute 3, warships across 5 constellations had captains sobbing into their respirators, choking on names they had never learned to pronounce. Weapons went cold. Orders dissolved. And for the first time in the Tyr language, a word found purchase where none had existed: mercy. Salt still hung in the air over what used to be Lindy. The Tyr's disciplinary sample had cut the harbor into a glassy bowl, sand transmogrified to mirrors, boats to teeth. Dr. Linvio stood at the rim in a paper mask that fooled no one and tuned a hand sensor through the taste of iodine and ash. Waveforms climbed her tablet like grieving hands. Commodore A.O. Mensa waited a few paces back, coat unbuttoned, eyes raw. "You saw the feed," he said. 200 spectator nations. Lesson delivered. Lynn didn't look up. Lessons can be unlearned. He flinched at that. On the horizon, modular barges craned down arrays the size of cathedrals, oval dishes studded with black ceramic tiles. Orpheus nodes. The press called it propaganda. Engineers called it madness. Lynn called it the last non-lethal option with a prayer attached. "The council wants escalation ladders," Mensa said. "I gave them rungs. Rail batteries, fold mines, the ugly box of last resorts. And they chose me," Lynn said, finally meeting his gaze. Her eyes were sleepless and stubborn. "Not because I can make people cry. Because I can make them hear." On her screen, a violin from Krakow braided into a Ghanaian dirge, then into a Vietnamese ho duolin. Lynn's thumb nudged the blend, pulses settled into a 0.1 to 0.2 Hz bass tide, breath rate, grief rate. The math of mourning. "Your dossier said neuroscience," Mensa said. "It also said ethnomusicology." She folded the tablet to reveal the back, a photograph of incense smoke curling above a crowded Hanoi alley. "My field notes call funerals the oldest social technology we have. You don't survive ice ages and empires without protocols for pain." Mensa stared at the mirrored harbor. His reflection stared back, cut into shards by the wind. "The Tyr don't have funerals. They have disposal." Lynn's voice chilled. "They call sorrow noise. They teach officers to sever affect in childhood. Efficient. Clean. Self-extinguishing. And you plan to reconnect the wire. Not plan. Perform." She nodded toward the barges. "Orpheus isn't sound. It's an effective codec timbral and rhythmic features mapped to cross-species autonomic signatures. Music for mirror neurons." She glanced at the sky, where satellites stitched faint lines between capitals. "We'll use the Schumann-coupled resonators to carry it through ionospheric standing waves, then piggyback on the galactic relay." The Tyr opened. They wanted an audience. Instead they get a congregation, Mensa said, and almost smiled. The council feed chimed in his ear. "Commodore, confirm you're prepared to transmit surrender message at T-60. He muted, eyes back on Lynn. "We sell compliance to bait them in. You're sure you can flip the room before they land?" "Nothing flips alone," Lynn said. "We'll give them the hollow where grief should live and a name to put inside it." "Name." She lifted a rough slate from her bag, chalk scrawled with columns. "We crowdsourced names. The dead of Lindy, of Maputo, of the fishing village the cameras skipped. 10,000 read by 10,000 mouths, staggered globally so the list never stops. Mensa swallowed. His grandmother had taught him the Akan proverb, "The dead are not gone if their names are spoken." The proverb was a technology too. He squared his shoulders. Broadcast the surrender. Tightrope over a volcano. He offered his hand. "If we fall, doctor, we fall loud." Lin shook it. "If we fall, they'll have to climb over a mountain of names." Above them, the light shifted. The tier opened a new relay, purple-banded and smug. Lin watched the spectrum spike. Mensa gave the council their theater. And somewhere on a ship that had never held a funeral, a junior lieutenant heard a bell that no one had taught him could break a heart. They built Orpheus inside a cathedral of code and borrowed rituals. A lab in Geneva hummed at 4 in the morning while streamed choirs in Accra and Birmingham recorded the same refrain in different tongues, "Take them home, take them home." A mixing room in Kyoto filtered woodblock pulses until they sat exactly on the respiration curve of 6 species. A teenager in Recife uploaded a phone memo his grandfather's foro lament, then apologized for the clipping. Lin wrote him a thank you and penciled his name into a corner of the slate. "How do you translate sorrow?" asked Seda, a systems engineer from Casablanca, soldering a ribbon of biosensors into a cuff. "You don't translate," Lin said without looking up. "You transpose. Keep the interval, change the key." Seda grinned. "You practice that line." 100 funerals, Lin said, not grinning at all. At a whiteboard, Lin sketched the codec, timber vectors feeding a low-dimensional manifold, rhythmic motifs tagged to autonomic reflexes, pupil dilation, galvanic skin, vagal tone. She didn't need to sell its beauty. It worked in rat pups and ravens. In simulations of tier cortical architectures, it didn't hurt. It connected. That distinction mattered like air. Mensa paced in with a mug and a stack of threat updates. "Fleet placements," he said, dropping citroops. "Tier are staging in the dark outer shells on our downlink. We'll have 40 minutes after they confirm the kneel." "Plenty," Lin said. "We only need 7 minutes. 7 days compacted," she said, drawing a line under the word refrain. "We'll time stretch the funeral arc so their autonomics can't hide in habituation. We open with distance low bells, far thunder bring in call and response, then interleave names." She tapped the board. "Key is the name cadence. 1 every second, cross-faded, global time. You never get to silence. Silence is what they weaponize," Mensa said. "Then we remove their high ground." Outside, a crate arrived stamped with custom seals from every block that still quibbled until the quibblers started attending vigils. Inside were instruments, an erhu, a kora, a battered trumpet that smelled like classrooms. Lin lifted each like a relic, not because she was sentimental, but because they were more than sound. They were file formats for human meaning that had survived plagues and inquisitions. Seda tightened the last sensor cuff, slid it onto Lin's forearm. Numbers spooled, heart rate, breathing, micro-tremors. A ghost of an ECG danced. "Conductor's baton," Seda said. Lin laughed once. "Conductor's leash." Mensa's wristcom buzzed. He checked the message, jaw ticking. "Our own hawks are losing patience. If Orpheus fails, they're ready to write the dark letters fold choking minds, guided tungsten, all the words that mean we did what we had to." Lin capped the marker. "Then let's succeed." In the adjoining bay, Teams tuned Schumann-coupled resonators, tall rings that would dump the refrains into Earth's ionospheric cavity and ride its standing waves like a surfboard. Satellite dishes would catch the lift and push the codec across the tier relay they'd oh so helpfully opened to flaunt their pedagogy. SATA's console pinged. A test packet reached a Luna outpost and came back with a note typed by a sleepless botanist. It made the leaves close, like dusk. Lynn wrote good on the board, then struck it out and wrote useful. Beauty was a luxury. She needed effect. By dusk in Geneva, the slate held more names. The list would never fit on any wall, so it would become the wall. Lynn ran the cadence through the manifold. Each name tugged a little on the breath rate subcarrier, a tremor in the shared chest. Mensa watched the graph flex. It looks like a lung. It is, Lynn said softly. One we have to teach the galaxy to use. The surrender message was a sculpture carved to collapse on cue. Mensa recorded it in a bare studio with no flags and a single light that made the circles under his eyes honest. This is Commodore A.O. Mensa of United Earth Command, he said to the lens. We will comply with tier instruction. Military assets stand down. Civil governance will accept oversight. We will not resist. The script carried hidden metadata timing marks that would unlock the Orpheus manifold across 5 uplinks when the tier rebroadcast it. They would rebroadcast. Tier doctrine loved nothing more than playing human submission back to the class. On the ops floor, SATA counted down. Galactic relay handshake in 3, 2, we're in. They're opening their language classroom. Lynn breathed in through her nose, out through her mouth. The cuffs mirrored the breath and primed the manifold. The first bell had to ring clean. Tier fleet to all systems, barked a translator. Observe the compliance of Earth. Note the efficiency of instruction. Mensa turned to Lynn. Your stage. Not mine, she said, and thumbed the slate into life. Across the planet, the first names fell like rain. Amina. Bao. Quasi. Marta. Each name rode a spike of hiss so soft that only nerves heard it, a sand grain that would grow into a pearl if given time. Behind them, the low bells rolled, not doom but distance. Then the Korra's gilded river, the Urhu's weeping metal, the trumpet's classroom joy turned elegy. At the tier relay command, someone laughed when Earth's surrender hymn began. Their captains tended to mock acoustics. Their war was push and measure, remove and reassign. The feed's base tugged at their viscera anyway. OMs into seconds. Seconds into a minute. On screen, numbers in the manifold whispered, pupil dilation up 6%. Breath synchrony across 9 species. A tier bridge officer blinked too slowly and missed a checkbox. Another hesitated at a confirm. Tiny stalls, microfractures in a doctrine that ran on certainty. Open the names, Lynn said. A school in Lagos. A kitchen in Busan. A pier in Galway. 10,000 mouths reading 10,000 syllables, imperfect, stubborn. On the manifold, the subcarrier flinched with every syllable like a shared diaphragm remembering what it was for. Mensa gripped the rail as the feed map bloomed. 200 civilizations tuned to the tier's channel heard Earth name its dead without asking permission. Chats exploded. Some mocked. Some prayed. Several went quiet. Signal clean, SATA said. They haven't noticed the uplink hijack. They notice, Mensa said, not looking away. They just don't think meaning can be a weapon. They're right, Lynn said. Weapon's the wrong shape. This is a mirror. We're just tilting it. Her cuff hummed. The manifold found its tempo, 0.1 Hz, the frequency of grown ups holding children while they cry. The feed shifted accordingly. Somewhere deep in a tear body, ancient mammal hardware tried to match the rhythm. Somewhere closer to the surface, a set of trained suppressors told it to stop. The suppressors started to lose. The first collapse happened on a destroyer called Efficient Correction. A junior gunnery officer Rishk, 19, tested at the 98th percentile for detachment looked up from his console because his mouth had formed a human name by accident. Me, N-A, he said, and the syllables scraped something raw in him that training had paved over. He reached to clear the buffer. His hand shook. The captain told him to adjust his respiration. Rishk inhaled on the 4, exhaled on the 6 like the drills. The manifold did the opposite, dragging his breath into the grief rate of strangers. He tried to hate them for it and found no handhold. On Efficient Correction's bridge camera, a drop fell off a cheek. It wasn't dramatic. It was small and stupid and caught on a jawline that had never learned its purpose. The weapons officer glanced over, saw it, and looked away as if modesty were the right response to another's nakedness. Across the fleet, similar micro-failures bloomed. A confirmation took 3 beats instead of 1. A bombardment schedule slipped because a captain needed to swallow twice. The doctrine manual had no flowchart for the first tier. "They're stalling," Seda whispered. "Subsystems going amber across 200 hulls. Ayo, we've got a wedge." "Hold fire," Mensa said automatically, the hardest order he'd ever given. The hawks were breathing down his neck from a dozen bunkers. "Crush them now." He watched a fortune of restraint accrue on the console. Lynn rode the cuff like a pilot in a crosswind, easing the manifold off spectacle into ache. "Bring in call and response," she said. A choir in Georgia answered a cantor in Jerusalem who answered a mourner's wail in Fez. The intervals locked like gears. Somewhere in the tier coordination net, a training daemon noticed and switched on countermeasures, Ondonia fields, low humming lattices that flattened pleasure and pain alike. The brutal cure for distraction. The numbers on Lynn's board quivered. "They're going numb," Seda warned. "Then we go low," Lynn said. She cut the high shimmer, drove the codec into the body's slowest highways, gut peristalsis, vestibular sway, the sense of being rocked by someone larger than you in a dark room while a storm punches the shutters. The manifold hummed at the root of the nervous system where thresholds are old and stubborn. Ondonia fought. It bludgeoned color. It sanded edges. It made triumph taste like dust and grief taste like dust and duty taste like dust. The names did not taste like anything. They weighed. On the slate, an elderly man in Inhambane said his daughter's name as if placing a stone on a grave. A woman in Ulaanbaatar followed with her brothers. A child in Naples mispronounced a surname, laughed at himself, then said it right, then cried because saying it right made it real. The manifold accepted all of it and carried the sum upstream. Rishk couldn't find his hands. They were there, but they belonged to someone he had never met, a person who had been at a shoreline, who had smelled iodine and ash, who had had a name once and a kitchen and a chipped bowl and a joke they told too often. Someone loved them. The love was huge and ordinary and undeniable. He wanted to return it and didn't know how. On the ops floor, Seda pointed. "Look." A tier destroyer powered down its forward batteries. Another safetied its magazines. A cruiser's captain stood up from his chair and took off his badge. The feed caught him setting it gently on the rail as if it were an infant you didn't want to wake. "They're not surrendering," Mensa said, voice low with something like awe. "They're refusing." Lin nodded without looking away. We didn't break their will. We introduced them to its object. Mensa exhaled. Somewhere in the council back channel, a hawk cursed and others fell silent. The manifold steadied at 0.1 Hz planet-wide. 200 worlds found themselves breathing to the same tide, not because Earth had made them weak, but because Earth had pointed at the hole in the hull and said, "Name it." Rishk wiped his face without shame and turned to his captain. "Request permission to stand down," he said, voice shaking. "Sir, I request permission to stand down while I learn the name I said." The captain's jaw worked. The badge glinted. The doctrine manual had never taught him how to answer a junior officer who had discovered a funeral. On Earth, the slate kept going. It would not finish, not today, not ever. That was the point. The galaxy listened and, for a suspended hour that would be counted in future calendars, mistook the sound of humanity's grief for the baseline of the universe. The tier named the device with their usual precision, effective noise cancellation array. To humans it sounded like a white noise machine for the soul. On the feed, a lattice of violet fields flowered from their flagships, washing decks in sterile light. Heart rate variability flattened. Pupils stopped blooming on grief like evening primroses. The manifold numbers slid toward zero as if grief were a river now freezing over. Seda swore softly. "They're throwing blankets on a burning building." Mensa's knuckles went pale on the rail. "If ice works, the hawks get their letters." Lin felt the cuff cooling her skin. Her own breath wanted to square off into a drill instructor's rectangle. Inhale 4, exhale 4, so she fought it, lengthened the exhale, fed the manifold a tide the arrays couldn't quite square. "They're blunting sensation," she said. "Sensation isn't the payload." She pointed at the slate, still spooling names like braided rope. "Meaning is." On efficient correction, Rishk's breathing steadied, but the steady felt wrong, too tidy, like a face wiped clean after a funeral before the taste of incense leaves your mouth. He watched his captain study the manual and saw a tremor in the older man's forearm. The tremor was tiny, treason-sized. "Ontonia at 80%, reported the ship's medic. "Recommend reinforcing detachment drills." The captain nodded without looking away from the clause about excusing a junior officer while the officer learns a word. It wasn't there. No flowchart for feelings. "Doctor," Seda said, "the field's catching up to the subcarrier. We'll lose the breath rate lock. We were never supposed to keep it forever." Lin tapped numbers, pulling the codec off body highways and onto older roads. Rhythm memories, lullaby cadences stored so deep that even numbness had to root around them. A drum pattern from Senegal whispered under a Chiapas funeral march. The trumpet's classroom joy returned, not as triumph but as the ache for it. Mensa's feed lit with council queries. Contingency? Plan B? Kinetic, like moths hitting a porch light. He muted the storm and watched Rishk, because the boy had become a clock for everything that mattered. The junior officer looked up again and this time said a different human name, halting and careful, as if placing a stone on a stranger's grave as practice for his own. The tier responded the way institutions always do when mirrors show them faces they don't recognize. They escalated. A second lattice unfurled, not numbness this time but distraction, bright pulse trains that mined novelty-seeking circuits, confetti for the cortex. The feed began to sparkle with algorithmic candy. Captains blinked in the light and forgot to weep. "New field," Seda warned. "Saccade hijack. They're making it impossible to look at one thing long enough to care." "Then we make caring the only anchor left," Lin said. She slid the manifold into a pattern she had never shown a committee, orphan chord, a harmonic that never resolves unless you say a name into it. Choirs around the world went quiet at once, leaving a hollow that yawned in the chest like an elevator starting down, like the moment before a verdict. The silence wasn't absence. It was invitation. Rish gasped. So did 1,000 others on 100 bridges. The arrays couldn't cancel an urge built into balance and grammar. Something in his bones asked for the chord to land. The only way was to place the syllables he had been given. He spoke the name properly, and the harmony settled like a hand finding yours in the dark. On the ops floor, a string of tier icons flipped from amber to gray. Not destroyed. Not surrendered. Simply standing down in order to speak. Mensa exhaled a laugh that sounded like it belonged in church. They're learning before they admit they can learn. Lynn swallowed hard. So are we. The hawks pinged again. Mensa didn't answer. He watched the tide under the numbers, numbness, confetti, hunger for resolution. And in that space between tricks, he saw the outline of the real fight over whether a civilization could be forced to feel without being violated. He turned to Lynn. We're on their deck now. Say your last difficult thing. She looked at the slate, now too heavy for one world to carry alone. We stop pushing, she said. We ask. Mensa blinked. Ask the people who erased Lindy to help us finish our funeral. To finish theirs, Lynn said. They don't have one. They can't stop killing until they do. He stared at her as if she'd asked him to lay down the sword in the middle of the charge. Then he nodded once, sharp. Transmit the ask. The message went out on the same channel where Earth had promised to kneel. Mensa's voice had no metal in it now. People of the tier, he said, and not empire, not command. We're holding a funeral. We don't know all the names. Help us. No threat. No clause about consequences. Just the shape of a door. On efficient correction, the captain sat back as if the chair had changed shape. His medic opened his mouth, closed it, and then violating 3 bullet points and a dozen assumptions spoke first. My sibling's hatchmate was reassigned during a pacification on a world with birds that laughed. I was taught not to. He had a designation. The medic swallowed. He had a name. I don't know it. Rishk, who had learned 2 human names and a word for the thing between them, said very quietly, we could ask. The ship's comms officer, a woman whose whole job was to shape speech into orders, said even more quietly, we could listen. The captain closed the doctrine manual with his palm. On a private channel he had never used, he spoke to an audience he had never believed existed. We request protocol 4. Linvio, you are on our bridge. Tell us where to put our hands. In Geneva, Lynn gripped the rail so hard the cuff squeaked. She didn't answer as a general. She answered like a daughter who'd memorized incense trails in alleys and a scientist who knew what bodies do when they're finally allowed to put a weight down. Find a name, she said, voice steady. Any name your war took. Say it aloud. If you cannot, say the emptiness where the name should be. Then stand still. We need terms, a counselor hissed in Mensa's ear. They must commit to. They're committing to the first ritual their empire has ever done, Mensa said, not muting, not apologizing. Let them finish the sentence. Across the fleet, something unmilitary happened. Officers stood. Not to salute. To be vertical in the presence of a fact. In mess halls and engine rooms and cabins where detachment drills had burned grooves, someone said a syllable that made a shape in the air and, by making it, made it heavier and real. Ujit. May. Suli. Underscore 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 underscore. The Ondonia fields flickered as if the arrays themselves were embarrassed to be running during this. The confetti pulses sputtered and died. The cortex doesn't chase glitter in a sanctuary. Seda tracked the manifold and whispered, "We've crossed the event horizon." "Into what?" Mensa asked. "A room with chairs," Lin said. "For the rest of the galaxy." They named the room before it existed, the Graves Accords. Not a treaty, a procedure. Before any species could lawfully initiate force, they would convene a bilateral memorial, names alternating, losses counted, the orphan cord waiting for words to land. No one could bomb through it without showing the whole sky who they were. The Tyr flagship broke into the channel. The face on the feed belonged to an admiral whose file called him SSA Rec, decorated for 72 corrections, incapable of regret by design. He spoke with the clipped grace of a man who had cut out everything but muscle. "You have invaded our interior," he said. "You call it asking, it is force." Lin met his eyes. "I know the difference. I live in it. We will stop broadcasting the codec now." Her thumb hovered. She looked at Mensa. He didn't make her ask. "Do it?" The manifold fell silent. The relief was immediate and frightening. In the quiet, the hunger to resolve the cord had nothing to lean on but will. SSA Rec's jaw flexed as a world without scaffolding pressed into his officers. "And if we choose not to, perform your ceremony," Mensa said, "then you choose to keep a hole where a heart could be. You can still rule that way. You just can't ask the galaxy to pretend it's not a hole." Rishk lifted his head on his captain's bridge and said, barely above a breath, "Sir, permission to speak a name." The captain nodded, and the Tyr's first funeral began. It started clumsy. Of course it did. Rituals always look ridiculous to the people who need them most. A Tyr gunnery chief held his hands wrong. A navigation officer tripped on a vowel. A medic said the blank instead of the name and then said the name as if climbing stairs to a door he wasn't sure he had the right to open. Earth did not correct. Earth echoed. A cathedral in Quito repeated the mispronounced syllables exactly, turning the mistake into the official spelling for 50 heartbeats so that meaning could cross the bridge before precision caught up. A circle of women in Kano recited a call that had moved children through measles camps and men through famines. Now it moved an empire through its first apology. The feed stitched a quilt. A Sufi dhikr lined with Buddhist bells aligned with a New Orleans second line. The marching turned to swaying. Body memory unlearned war postures because they were inefficient for carrying. 200 civilizations watched the enemy learn to hold weight without turning it into weapon or garbage. SSA Rec remained on the line, face stone. He was good at stone. It had been his job. But the camera caught something not built for cameras, his hands, clasped too tight and then unclasped out of frame, as if trying to remember how to be tools for something other than commands. Mensa spoke only when necessary. He vetoed kinetic accidents. He refused triumphal overlays. He let the ceremony do the slower violence, the kind that kills certainty. On efficient correction, Rishk finished saying the human names he'd practiced and then, in a whisper he didn't recognize as his own, said one from a world the doctrine called a backwater. The syllable trembled. The medic nodded once, grateful like a man handed water after carrying shame too far. The captain breathed out a sentence that doctrine had no shelf for. "We will not fire today." 100 ships echoed. Not surrender. Not yet. But a mutiny against emptiness. The galaxy's chat translated into 100 memes, 1,000 essays, 10,000 policy drafts. A mining union on a cold moon voted to refuse contracts from powers without memorial protocols. A choir on an ocean planet composed a refrain that would become the intake valve for ambassadors centuries later. A pirate confederation threatened to enforce the Graves Accords with privateers if states wouldn't. SSA-Rec blinked once, slow. This ceremony, what is its objective function? Lynn almost laughed. She answered with a scientist's bones and a daughter's skin. To make sure there are fewer ceremonies next year. Silence isn't silence in a room like that. It's the sound of a calculus being rewritten. At last he said, we will convene. But if the galaxy remembers us as weak. Mensa cut in, gentle and sharp. They will remember you as dangerous in a way that doesn't require you to burn your children to stay warm. SSA Rex's mouth made a shape that might one day, in a different language, be forgiveness. Tell us where to put our chairs. They built the Graves Accords out of ugly furniture and beautiful rules. No marble, no flags, only a circle of seats and a slate in the middle where names could be written as fast as mouths could make them. Every war talk began there. Some ended there, too, without moving to the table with maps. The Hawks called it theater. They weren't wrong. Theater is how species rehearse the people they want to be in case the real thing happens. Mensa learned to open sessions by acknowledging the dead before the living rattled sabers. Lynn became the keeper of tempo, the one who could feel when a room needed a drum or a silence or a child's mispronunciation to make the shape of mercy possible. Rishk took off his badge and put on a civilian coat. He became the tier's first grief officer, then their second and third when language failed and titles fractured. He carried a small slate around his neck. He never erased it. He was asked on talk shows if he forgave humans. He always answered a different question, I remember them. SSA Rec faded into a role doctrine had excised from his vocabulary elder. He didn't apologize on feeds. He didn't have the muscle group yet. He did something harder. He sat through ceremonies and didn't leave when his subordinates wanted him to. In retirement he taught cadets how to say the names of planets like greetings instead of ultimatums. Earth didn't become pure. No story with humans ends that way. There were regimes that tried to weaponize funerals, to force outcomes with names. Lynn called them out on air, and the choir answered by refusing to sing their notes. Deterrence grew teeth the size of empathy. Pirates enforced protocols with an efficiency that made states blush. The galaxy learned a phrase that fit on protest banners and airlock doors alike, do not skip the room with chairs. On anniversaries, Mensa still visited the rim of Lindy's glassed harbor. The mirrors had weathered into waves, you could see sky in them if you stood at the right angle. He would kneel, old joints complaining, and press his palm to warm stone. Tourists asked for photos. He declined. He wasn't a statue. He was a man who had once chosen not to fire and watched the world not end. Lynn refused statues, too. She kept the cuff in a drawer with incense and chalk. She taught interns to tune with their ribs, not their apps. At night she dreamed of the orphan chord and woke to a city that now held weekly potlucks where people learned to say neighbor names without fear of being corrected. On a humid night 10 years after the first broadcast, the galaxy tuned in again. Not for ultimata. For a concert. Choirs from 50 worlds stood under a scaffold of dull metal at the edge of the old harbor. Seda adjusted a mic stand. Rishk took a seat in the third row and fidgeted like a rookie. SSA Rec watched from a balcony in shadow. Mensa and Lynn shared a look that belonged to people who had survived their own certainty. The conductor some days Lynn, Today a teenager from Recife raised both hands. The room with chairs expanded until it was a coastline, then a sky. The first note wasn't a weapon or a mirror. It was a welcome. They did not name the dead first. They named the living, the children born after the broadcast, the species that had adopted chairs, the pirates who'd chosen to enforce protocols instead of extort them, the diplomats who'd learned to carry slates instead of swords. Then they named the dead again, because memory's job is never finished. SSA Rex hands unclasped. The galaxy didn't become gentle. It became interruptible. Wars started, and rooms with chairs pulled them off their rails, not every time, not forever, but enough to change average weather. The tier still had fleets. Earth still had drones. But both had choirs that could call officers back from edges doctrine never meant them to see. After the concert, a reporter asked Lynn what Orpheus had been. Really? A rehearsal, she said. For what? For the day we won't need a codec to recognize a human kitchen in a stranger's chest, she answered, and smiled like a daughter at a doorway where the incense is still warm. That night, the harbor threw the stars back at the sky, and the sky did not mind being imitated. Somewhere in a ship with no doctrine for this, an old officer practiced saying a name into a silence that finally knew how to hold it. And somewhere on a cold moon, a Union steward pinned up a poster that said the thing the galaxy had learned the slow way. Don't wake the humans, invite them to sing.